Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. Some truths don't knock. They break the door off its hinges. When the private investigator opened your file, the room shifted. Not because of what was found, but because of what couldn't be explained. The data made sense. Dates, names, timelines. But the essence didn't. It was as if reality itself took a deep breath and whispered, "You weren't supposed to find that." What began as a routine background check became an existential crisis for the investigator. They'd uncovered frauds, lies, and double lives before, but never purpose. Never the kind of truth that makes logic pack its bags and leave the room. And here's the part that made their coffee go cold. The more they dug, the less they could label you. Every record contradicted the narrative. Every detail they thought would expose you ended up exalting you. There were no skeletons in your closet, just the blueprints for resurrection. They were paid to find flaws, but instead, they found evidence that you were never playing the same game as everyone else. And to be fair, it's hard to keep your composure when the person you're investigating starts looking less like a suspect and more like a signpost for divine interference. At one point, they even checked if your birth certificate had been forged, not out of suspicion, but disbelief. Because no file should read like prophecy. So, when the truth about you surfaced, it didn't just make them pause, it made them freeze. Because how do you report on someone whose existence itself is the twist ending? And somewhere between the facts and the fingerprints, the investigator realized this wasn't an exposure. It was an awakening dressed as an assignment. Number 1. They expected dirt, but found divinity. When the investigator began digging into your life, they were certain they'd uncover something messy, a scandal, a weakness, a trace of imperfection that would make you look ordinary. That's what most investigations lead to, the quiet proof that people are rarely who they pretend to be. But yours wasn't like that. Every path they followed led somewhere unexpected. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that your story wasn't built on manipulation or luck. It was built on something much harder to define, something clean, unshakable, and deeply intentional. They found mistakes, sure, but none that stained you. Each one had been turned into something redemptive, like every failure had been recycled into wisdom. They saw pain that should have destroyed you, but instead, it looked like it had been refined into peace. They expected bitterness and found balance. They expected ego and found depth. They expected chaos and found alignment. What they uncovered didn't read like the story of a survivor. It read like the evidence of someone who'd been protected while being perfected. It started to unsettle them. The longer they studied your timeline, the more they realized that nothing about your rise made sense. You didn't come from privilege or connections. You didn't have the kind of help that explains success. Yet there it was. Consistency, resilience, light. Every setback in your history looked more like strategy than misfortune. Every closed door appeared to redirect you rather than stop you. And somewhere between the files, they stopped investigating and started observing. Because how do you analyze grace? How do you document favor that can't be measured? They came looking for flaws to expose, but all they found was proof that you'd been walking with something, or someone, that kept turning the impossible into order. That was the moment they froze, because they realized they weren't uncovering secrets. They were standing in the presence of something sacred. Number 2, your life wasn't a scandal. It was a study in sovereignty. When they started tracing your history, they were convinced they'd find patterns of manipulation or desperation, the kind of moves people make when they're trying too hard to look like they've got it together. But what they found was something entirely different. Your story didn't unfold like someone trying to survive the system. It read like someone who quietly learned how to rise above it. You didn't play the victim, and you didn't chase validation. Every step you took looked intentional, even when it didn't make sense to others. They went through the moments people called your downfall and realized they were watching transitions, not collapses. You didn't break under pressure, you recalibrated. You didn't fight for control, you embodied it. There was a kind of stillness in your decisions that unnerved them. It was the stillness of someone who knew that peace wasn't the absence of chaos, but the refusal to be owned by it. You didn't use your pain as a prop, and you didn't beg for understanding. You let the results speak, and that's what unsettled them most. The investigator saw that everything in your life, the setbacks, the silence, the comebacks, was synchronized with a kind of unseen order. You weren't being reactive, you were being directed. Sovereignty means ruling your own territory, and that's exactly what your energy reflected. Quiet, disciplined rulership over yourself. What shocked them most was how much authority you carried without titles, without noise, without trying to prove anything. You weren't performing for approval. You were operating from alignment. Your power didn't come from being seen. It came from being grounded. That realization changed everything for them, because your life didn't expose weakness, it exposed mastery. They thought they were investigating someone pretending to be powerful, but what they actually found was someone who had already taken the throne within, long before the world ever noticed. Number 3. They discovered that your silence was strategy, not surrender. The investigator kept wondering why you never defended yourself, why you didn't clap back, expose or retaliate when you clearly had every reason to. To them, your quiet was confusing. In their world, silence usually means guilt, fear, or weakness. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized your silence had purpose. It wasn't submission, it was control. You weren't avoiding conflict, you were mastering timing. You understood that some battles aren't won by noise, but by knowing when to withhold your power. Every record, every message, every encounter told the same story. Restraint. You didn't react when provoked, and that baffled them. People expected you to lose your composure, to prove them right, to respond emotionally, but you didn't. You let them talk, you let them assume, and you kept moving. That wasn't ignorance, it was intelligence, because you knew that noise feeds chaos and silence protects truth. What unsettled the investigator was that your quiet always came before transformation. Whenever you withdrew, something evolved. Every time you went silent, your results got louder. They started to understand that you didn't need to announce what was already in motion. Your silence wasn't a gap. It was a signal that something greater was being built out of sight. They noticed how people mistook your calm for indifference, not realizing you were reading everything, remembering everything, but responding to nothing that didn't deserve your energy. You weren't hiding, you were collecting understanding. You weren't passive, you were positioning yourself. By the time they pieced it together, they were in awe. Your silence wasn't empty. It was loaded with awareness, timing, and discernment. It was your form of dominance, quiet enough to be underestimated, wise enough to be unstoppable. And that's when they finally saw the truth. Your silence wasn't the absence of fight. It was the sound of victory already secured. Number 4. The records revealed. You never needed validation. You were the validation. They thought they'd expose what made you unqualified, but the truth showed you were the standard their world was trying to measure up to. When the investigator started going through your records, they were searching for proof that your confidence was borrowed, that your rise was built on image, luck, or clever presentation. They expected to find a trail of approval-seeking, people-pleasing, or a desperate need to be recognized. Instead, they found something unsettling. You had been self-assured long before anyone clapped for you. Your foundation wasn't made of compliments, it was built from conviction. You didn't wait for anyone to validate your worth. You moved like someone who already knew it. Every detail in your history reflected a person who never needed permission to exist fully. You weren't chasing belonging, you were creating it. The investigator noticed you didn't bend to trends, didn't modify your values to fit in, and didn't dilute yourself for comfort. You didn't need the world to stamp your authenticity. You were the stamp. Your life itself had become the reference point that others quietly used to adjust their own standards. What shook them most was realizing how consistent you'd been. Even when people doubted or dismissed you, your rhythm never changed. You didn't compete, you built. You didn't prove, you produced. And that kind of inner stability can't be taught. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you carry. The more they studied you, the more it became clear. The validation others chase was already embedded in your presence. You were the mirror that exposed people's insecurities because you moved without asking for their permission to shine. You weren't performing for approval. You were embodying authenticity. That's when the investigator stopped looking for evidence of worth and started realizing they were standing in front of it. Because what they thought was arrogance turned out to be alignment. And what they tried to measure could never be quantified, because you weren't seeking validation. You were born as the proof that it was never needed. Number 5, they found that every betrayal you faced became an investment in discernment. Each time someone crossed you, it didn't crush you. It refined your perception until you could see deception from miles away. The investigator saw the pattern immediately. Betrayal after betrayal, heartbreak after heartbreak. And yet, not a single trace of bitterness. They couldn't understand how someone who had been so mishandled could still move with calm and clarity. But the truth was simple. Every wound had taught you something no classroom could. Each disappointment had sharpened your instincts, stripped away illusions, and forced you to see people and intentions for what they truly were. You didn't come out colder, you came out wiser. Every time someone lied, you learned to listen beyond words. Every time you were underestimated, you discovered the power of observing quietly. Every time trust was broken, your spirit built a stronger filter. You stopped taking people at face value and started reading their patterns, their tones, their silences. That's why betrayal never broke you. It educated you. The investigator noticed how you no longer reacted emotionally to manipulation. You'd seen too much to fall for the same tricks twice. Your intuition had become surgical. It could cut through charm, titles, and pretense in seconds. What others called paranoia was actually precision. You weren't suspicious. You were spiritually street smart. They realized your past betrayals had built an inner compass that rarely missed. You learned how to trust energy over explanations, actions over apologies, consistency over charisma. You no longer needed people to reveal their intentions. They did it through how they handled your peace. What was meant to destroy your ability to trust, instead, strengthened your ability to discern. You no longer gave everyone access to you, not because you feared pain, but because you finally understood your worth. Every betrayal was a transaction that brought you clarity, and that clarity became your power. The kind that can't be manipulated, only respected. Number 6. They saw you were never hiding. You were healing in plain sight. You weren't disappearing. You were detoxing from environments that couldn't handle your authenticity. When the investigator reviewed the quiet stretches of your life, the times you went unseen, unheard, or withdrawn, they assumed it was retreat. To them, it looked like you'd faded out or lost momentum. But as they dug deeper, it became clear that those silent seasons weren't about hiding. They were about healing. You weren't avoiding the world. You were removing yourself from places that kept confusing your peace for passivity, and your depth for difficulty. They noticed how you didn't announce your absence, and you didn't owe anyone explanations. You simply stepped back when things started to feel heavy, dishonest, or draining. It wasn't rejection. It was self-preservation. You stopped showing up where your soul had to shrink to be accepted. You stopped pouring into rooms that applauded your pain but ignored your growth. And while everyone thought you'd gone missing, you were really just getting back what the noise had taken from you: clarity, alignment, and self-respect. The investigator saw the pattern. Every time you went quiet, you came back sharper, lighter, and stronger. That wasn't coincidence. It was the proof of inner work. You weren't running away from life. You were recalibrating how you lived it. Those who once called you distant had no idea that your distance was discipline. You were learning how to exist without needing to be everywhere or approved by everyone. They realized your solitude was never a symptom. It was a sanctuary. Healing wasn't something you hid behind closed doors. It was happening right there in your choices, in your peace, in your refusal to return to what hurt you. You didn't need the world to witness your process, only your progress. And that's when it became clear to them. You never vanished. You were simply clearing space for your wholeness to re-enter the room. And when you did, the difference was undeniable. Number 7. The report proved you never needed revenge. Your evolution was enough. Every painful chapter they expected to ruin you only amplified your glow. Your growth became their greatest exposure. When the investigator pieced together the parts of your story that were supposed to be your breaking points, something unexpected stood out. You never retaliated. You didn't chase revenge, expose anyone, or try to prove your worth through payback. You simply kept evolving. Every wound became wisdom, every setback turned into strategy, and every attempt to humiliate you only highlighted how untouchable your peace had become. They were looking for signs of bitterness, but found brilliance instead. You didn't waste your energy trying to make anyone regret losing you. You turned your focus inward and built something out of what was meant to destroy you. That's what unsettled the investigator. The fact that your success wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. You didn't fight to be seen. Your transformation made visibility inevitable. You became living proof that revenge is a waste when evolution can do the talking. They traced the names of those who wronged you, the betrayals that could have crushed you, the slander meant to silence you, and all they found was grace. You didn't match energy, you raised vibration. You didn't seek closure, you created elevation. The same people who once tried to tear you down now had to watch your peace become their reminder of who they failed to break. The investigator realized that your rise didn't humiliate your enemies, it humbled them. You didn't have to expose anyone because your evolution made every hidden truth visible. The contrast between your peace and their chaos told the whole story. By the time they finished the report, it was undeniable. You never sought revenge because your very existence became the proof of justice. Your growth was the verdict. And in a world obsessed with payback, you mastered the art of letting your progress do the punishing. Number 8. They realized you never lost anything. You were being cleared for alignment. The things and people that vanished didn't abandon you. They were evacuated to make room for your purpose. When the investigator looked into the parts of your life that looked like loss, they expected to find regret, brokenness, and grief that never healed. But what they discovered instead was order, a quiet rhythm of removal that always seemed to happen right before something greater entered. It wasn't coincidence, it was calibration. Every person who walked away, every opportunity that fell through, every door that slammed shut, none of it was rejection. It was realignment. They noticed how you never begged for what left. You might have felt the sting, but you didn't chase. You accepted that anything meant for you wouldn't require you to shrink, plead, or prove yourself. That level of peace unsettled them, because it didn't match the story of someone who had lost. It matched the energy of someone being positioned. You didn't lose things. You outgrew them. You didn't lose people. You evolved past their version of you. The investigator traced every ending and saw a pattern. After each departure came an upgrade. When friends turned to strangers, focus replaced distraction. When opportunities collapsed, purpose filled the gap. When certain relationships faded, clarity took their place. The losses that were supposed to weaken you had quietly built your alignment muscle. You had learned to release without resentment and trust timing without tension. They realized you weren't empty. You were being edited. The universe was trimming what couldn't go where you were headed. That's why your peace remained. Because you understood that everything that left had completed its assignment. Nothing was stolen. It was simply finished. By the end of their investigation, it became clear that your story wasn't about loss at all. It was about divine organization. You weren't being stripped of value. You were being shaped for destiny. Everything that walked away was just making space for what was truly yours to begin with. Number 9. They found out your reputation wasn't built on approval. It was built on evidence. Your character wasn't curated online. It was carved in moments no one saw, where you chose integrity over applause. When the investigator started piecing together your reputation, they were ready to find the usual, a carefully crafted image, a performance stitched together with filters, followers, and well-timed words. But that wasn't what your life showed. There was no manipulation, no false branding, no exaggerated version of success. What they found instead was consistency, a quiet track record of doing right, even when no one was watching. Your credibility wasn't built in public. It was earned in private. Every decision you made when it would have been easier to cheat, lie, or cut corners became a brick in the foundation of your authenticity. You didn't need to advertise your values because they spoke for you in how you lived. You weren't loud about your goodness. You were reliable about it. That's what gave your name weight. The investigator noticed something that couldn't be faked: alignment. The person you were behind closed doors matched the person people saw in public. You didn't adjust your morals based on the audience. You didn't treat people well because it looked good. You did it because it was right. In a world obsessed with perception, your truth was your brand. And that level of integrity can't be built overnight. It's earned through small, quiet, disciplined choices that leave fingerprints time can't erase. They realized your reputation wasn't a result of others' opinions. It was the residue of your actions. You didn't rely on validation to prove your worth. Your results, your peace, and your consistency were the proof. The respect you carried wasn't bought or borrowed. It was accumulated through years of doing what needed to be done when no one was clapping. By the time they finished their review, the investigator saw it clearly. Your life didn't need defending because it already had documentation. The evidence wasn't in words or likes. It was in the undeniable pattern of integrity that followed your name wherever it was spoken. Number 10. They saw that you didn't chase power. You became it. The investigation showed what the world missed. Your authority wasn't inherited or borrowed. It was earned through endurance. When the investigators studied your rise, they expected to find a powerful connection, a secret back door, or someone influential pulling strings behind the scenes. But there was none of that. What they found was harder to explain. Your power didn't come from privilege. It came from perseverance. You didn't chase influence or control. You simply refused to break. And that endurance transformed into authority. You had walked through storms that should have left you bitter, but instead they built your backbone. Every trial became a training ground, every loss became a lesson, and every moment you were overlooked became another opportunity to sharpen your strength in silence. You didn't demand respect. You developed it. That's the kind of power that can't be handed down or manufactured. It's the kind that grows from having nothing left but the will to keep going. The investigator noticed something consistent. Every time life tried to strip you of power, it accidentally revealed how much of it you already had. You didn't manipulate to get ahead. You didn't step on others to stand taller. You didn't play politics or disguise your truth. You just kept showing up, doing the work, and surviving what was meant to silence you. And somewhere in that process, you stopped chasing power because you realized you were it. They saw how your presence commanded rooms without effort. It wasn't arrogance, it was alignment. Your energy carried authority because it was forged in truth, not image. People listened to you because they could feel the weight of everything you'd overcome behind every word. By the time the investigation was done, it was undeniable. Your power wasn't situational, it was structural. You had become what others tried to imitate. Not because you wanted control, but because you learned that real power isn't taken or given. It's embodied. And you carried it like someone who had already paid the full price for it. Number 11. They discovered the real you couldn't be weaponized. Every attempt to distort your image collapsed because truth doesn't negotiate with fabrication. When the investigator reviewed every rumor, every twisted narrative, and every false version of you that had been passed around, they expected at least some of it to stick. But nothing did. The lies didn't hold because your life had evidence. Every time someone tried to weaponize your name, reality quietly dismantled their claims. You didn't have to argue or defend yourself. Your consistency did that for you. You had built such a solid foundation of truth that no manipulation could find traction. They saw how people had tried to paint you as difficult, arrogant, or delusional, but every record, every message, every witness pointed to something else. Integrity. You weren't perfect, but you were real. And real can't be twisted without exposing the hands that twist it. The investigator noticed how those who spoke against you eventually contradicted themselves because deception has an expiration date. Lies only last until truth walks in. And you walked in with evidence, not explanation. You never fought to clear your name because you understood something most people don't. Truth doesn't rush to prove itself. It waits. You knew that time has a way of peeling back falsehood and returning everything to its rightful order. You weren't avoiding confrontation. You were trusting alignment. And sure enough, every attempt to discredit you only revealed who was threatened by your light. The investigator realized your authenticity made you untouchable. You were too transparent to be misrepresented. The facts stood taller than the fiction. Even in silence, your reputation corrected the story. The more they tried to use your truth against you, the more it backfired, because what's genuine can't be repurposed as ammunition. By the end, it was clear. The real you couldn't be weaponized because you were never performing. You were grounded in truth, and truth, when lived, becomes its own defense. Number 12. They uncovered that you were never the victim. You were the mirror. The chaos people blamed you for only reflected what they were running from within themselves. When the investigator started studying the conflicts surrounding your name, they expected to find evidence that you were the cause, that maybe you had stirred things up, provoked situations, or secretly fueled the tension. But as they traced each event back, the truth was different. You weren't the source of the chaos. You were the mirror that revealed it. People weren't reacting to your behavior. They were reacting to their own reflection in your presence. You didn't have to do much for people to project onto you. Your peace made them confront their unrest. Your confidence made them see their insecurity. Your honesty forced them to face the lies they told themselves. The investigator realized that every time someone accused you of being the problem, it was really because you illuminated the parts of them they couldn't hide from anymore. You didn't break them. You exposed what was already cracking. They found evidence of how people tried to twist your intentions or label you difficult just to justify their discomfort. It was easier for them to blame you than to face the truth that you triggered their unresolved pain. You became their scapegoat, not because you were guilty, but because you were transparent. Your authenticity acted like a mirror. It reflected everything they were trying to suppress. What fascinated the investigator was how you never retaliated. You didn't fight for validation or try to convince anyone of your innocence. You just stayed true to yourself, and with time, the truth always surfaced. The same people who once tried to villainize you eventually had to face the fact that the conflict was never about you. It was about their own unhealed reflection. By the end of the investigation, one thing was undeniable. You were never the victim. You were the revelation people weren't ready for. And when truth walks into a room disguised as a person, it doesn't destroy. It simply exposes what was hiding in plain sight. Number 13. They found out your destiny wasn't in the data. It was in the divine. No file, document, or rumor could quantify the spiritual weight of your assignment. You weren't a case. You were a calling. When the investigator tried to map out your life, they did it the only way they knew how. Through facts, figures, and timelines. But no matter how much data they collected, nothing explained the depth of your journey. Your story refused to fit inside their reports. You didn't rise because of opportunity or connections. You rose because something greater was guiding you. The patterns didn't add up because your path wasn't logical. It was divine. They found records of where you came from, but those records couldn't explain where you were going. They saw setbacks that should have ended you, yet somehow each one became a stepping stone. Every time your life was supposed to collapse, something unseen caught you and pushed you higher. That's when they realized this wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. You weren't being lucky, you were being led. They tried to find the formula behind your resilience, the source of your peace, the secret to your consistency. But nothing in their systems could account for grace. The more they analyzed, the more frustrated they became, because your strength wasn't academic or genetic, it was spiritual. You didn't follow trends or logic, you followed timing. And timing like that doesn't come from effort, it comes from alignment. Every note in their report pointed to one truth. Your life was evidence of divine interference. You weren't achieving. You were fulfilling. The things that worked for you weren't random blessings. They were confirmations. You weren't hustling for purpose. You were walking in it. By the time they finished, the investigator understood what the data couldn't hold, that some stories can't be studied, only witnessed. You weren't a mystery to solve. You were a message in motion. Your destiny wasn't built from information. It was written in revelation. Number 14. They realized you were the one thing they couldn't investigate, only experience. You can't be summarized in a report. You are revelation, the kind that freezes the observer because truth that pure demands reverence. When the investigator reached the end of their research, they thought they'd have answers, a full understanding of who you were, what shaped you, and how you became who you are. But instead of clarity, they found themselves speechless. The more they studied you, the less sense it made in human terms. You couldn't be dissected, labeled, or reduced to data points. Everything about you carried a weight that information couldn't hold. You weren't a puzzle to solve. You were a presence to encounter. They realized your essence couldn't be captured by observation alone, because what made you different wasn't visible. It was spiritual. You didn't operate on patterns that logic could predict. You flowed in ways that only alignment could explain. Every attempt to define you only exposed the limits of human reasoning. The investigator had studied hundreds of people before, but you were the first who made them question the very tools they used to measure worth. What stunned them most was how you seemed to move through life rather than just exist in it. There was something about your energy, quiet but commanding, soft but unshakable, that felt less like personality and more like purpose wearing skin. It wasn't something they could record or replicate. You didn't fit into a category, you created your own. By the end, they stopped analyzing and simply sat in awe. Because what they were witnessing wasn't a case study, it was a living revelation. You weren't just someone who survived or succeeded, you were proof of what happens when truth takes human form. And for the first time, the investigator understood that some people aren't meant to be explained, they're meant to be experienced. You were one of them. In the end, the investigator didn't just close a case, they closed a chapter of misunderstanding. What began as an attempt to expose you became an awakening to something beyond comprehension. They came searching for flaws but found favor. They expected a story of survival but uncovered a study in sovereignty. Every file they opened, every record they analyzed, only confirmed that your existence defied explanation. You weren't a scandal, you were a statement. You weren't being examined, you were being revealed. They realized that you weren't the subject of investigation. You were the revelation that stopped it. Every attempt to decode your strength only led back to one undeniable truth. You were built by something that can't be documented, only divinely designed. Your journey wasn't random, it was intentional. Your scars weren't evidence of defeat, they were proof of endurance. And the moment they understood that, silence filled the room, not the silence of confusion, but of awe. Because how do you report on someone who isn't just living a story but embodying a message? You can't. You simply bear witness. And that's what your life has become. A testimony that truth, alignment, and grace always outlast deception, noise, and doubt. You weren't just investigated, you were revealed. If this message spoke to your spirit, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful revelations like this. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Someone out there needs this reminder today. Your support helps spread light, truth, and awakening to more souls across the world. Stay grounded, stay aligned, and keep becoming everything they said you couldn't be. Stay awakened, chosen ones.